Here is a world of communication, bringing together all people in a new era of understanding.
Elektrischer Reporter.
Urheberrecht, liebe Zuschauer daheim an den Empfangsgeräten oder von wo auch immer Sie uns gerade zusehen. Urheberrecht war noch vor wenigen Jahren ein winzig kleines Fachgebiet, für das sich gerade einmal ein paar wenige Rechtsexperten erwärmen konnten. Seit das Internet in unser aller Leben getreten ist, hat sich das entscheidend geändert. Denn jeder, der digitale Technologien einsetzt, läuft über kurz oder lang Gefahr, mit dem Urheberrecht auf Kriegsfuß zu geraten. Der amerikanische Rechtsprofessor Lawrence Lessig weist seit Jahren unermüdlich auf das Konfliktpotenzial und die seiner Meinung nach innovationshemmende Wirkung des aktuellen Urheberrechts hin. Im Jahre 2003 prozessierte er vor dem obersten Gerichtshof der USA gegen eine Verlängerung des Copyright auf 95 Jahre, vergeblich. Parallel dazu rief Lessig die Creative Commons Initiative ins Leben, ein System, das es Autoren ermöglicht, Nutzern ihrer Werke unkompliziert bestimmte Freiheiten einzuräumen. Warum die meisten Politiker diese Problematik nicht begreifen, warum das 20. Jahrhundert kulturhistorisch eine Ausnahme bildete und was DRM und DDT miteinander gemeinsam haben, das erklärt uns nun Lawrence Lessig.
Well, the copyright laws were written for a radically different technology and for a world where they regulated a very small portion of the public. So basically publishers or musicians or people in commercial relationship to culture were regulated by copyright law. All of ordinary citizens were unregulated by copyright law. Because of digital technologies, though, and because everything you do with culture now produces a copy, copyright law is triggered whenever you do anything with culture. And so the law now regulates absolutely everybody with a computer or anybody accessing content across the internet. And the fundamental problem then is that the law designed to regulate a bunch of big companies in the 19th and 20th century doesn't make sense when it's regulating everybody who used digital technologies in the 21st century. Well, I actually think that very few benefit from the existing regulation. It's just a bad architecture for copyright. But the people who are using it to stifle new kinds of business or new kinds of competition are typically companies that are trying to protect a business model. And the business model was one developed 100 years ago. The business model is business model of controlling the distribution of particular copies. That's the architecture of copyright law. But in a world where we have 1,000 ways to get access to content, that particular business model is actually quite inhibiting to the potential that digital technologies gives to the widest range of people to become creators and to share in the creativity that they produce. The default rule of copyright is all rights reserved, which means copyright gives the copyright owner a bundle of rights, and copyright law says all of those rights are held by the author automatically. And if you'd like to exercise any of those rights, if you'd like to copy or distribute the work, you've got to ask permission first. And what we recognized was that asking permission first typically meant talking to a lawyer, and lawyers are expensive and cumbersome, and so the process of clearing permissions is so cumbersome in many cases where the author doesn't actually care to restrict the use of the work. So we wanted to give authors a simple way to mark their content with the freedoms they intended to carry, so that people know how they can rely and use copyrighted works consistent with the underlying rights that the author has, and there's not a need for the heavy burden or complexity of lawyers in the middle of the process. In my view, the 20th century was a very odd century in the history of culture. Before the 20th century, culture, of course, was something that was produced by famous, influential artists, but it was also something that was produced and shared by members of the public much more frequently. People would participate in the creation and spreading of work. Folk music was developed in exactly this way. And the idea of professional culture was really the exception. The 20th century, professional culture becomes the norm. And the whole idea of culture is something you buy and consume, and the consumer has no rights to do anything with that culture. It's just culture that's produced for them to use but not to build upon. There's a very funny pattern that happens in the 20th century. We move from a read-write culture to a read-only culture, and back to a read-write culture as we move into the 21st century, or at least that's the possibility. When you're talking about video or music, recorded music, in the 20th century that didn't matter much because most people didn't have the technology to do anything with video or do anything with recorded music. The most you could do is make a mixed tape. You couldn't actually do anything with the underlying mix of the music. But now that digital technologies has democratized access to this capacity so that anybody can have a high-definition video camera and begin to make video that rivals that of professional video producers, now there's a much stronger demand for ordinary people to be participants in the creation and spreading of culture. And that's what I mean by read-write, that technology is encouraging many people to be much more active in the creation and sharing of culture. Now, often that means remixing culture of others, critically remixing it or affectionately remixing it, maybe mashing together two different works in a way that makes a point about those two different works. That's the way in which this form of creativity is expressed. But the point is, it's creativity that now is spread through the culture as opposed to concentrated in a relatively few at the top. The best way to think about it is contrast the norms and the rules that exist with text and the norms and the rules that exist with video and music. All of us take for granted that we can write anything we want. All we've got to do when we quote somebody is cite that person. The idea that you have to call the person up and ask permission to quote them is ridiculous. Writing is a quintessentially democratic form of expression. And that's because for the last 400 years, cultures have developed where we teach our children how to write and we expect everybody ought to have that capacity. But the reality is today, text is an extremely insignificant way for people to get access to information about their world. Most people get access to information about their world through media, video, and music, and content like that. And so one way to think of this is whether the same freedoms that exist with text will exist in the context of video and music and that form of expression. Now, traditionally, the answer to that has been no. And that's because the people who have produced video or film or music have typically been commercial producers, and those people have had a relationship of permissions to facilitate their creativity. But once anybody can be a filmmaker, once anybody can be a musician, once anybody can take music and remix it using digital technologies, norms and laws that expect that you have a lawyer sitting next to you whenever you're doing your production no longer make sense. So the same democratic access to that media that exists with text, I think, will increasingly exist with video and audio. And that will be critically important to the political process because that's where communication happens today. That's how people understand the world. So I have one of my favorite examples to show when I speak is this wonderful clip of George Bush and Tony Blair singing Lionel Richie's Endless Love. And so you have George Bush and Tony Blair singing this love song to you. And the complexity of the message that's being conveyed in that minute-long clip is extraordinary, and it has a political impact which is profound, much more profound than any op-ed you could have written in any newspaper. Right? Well, that's because we've become a media consumer. That's how we understand the world. And the only point many of us are trying to make is that now that the technology gives the ability for anybody to use this, the law shouldn't be stopping people from using this way, using these technologies to speak. There have been a number of cases where copyright owners have asserted their rights in a way which attempts to block access to material. For example, in the United States, a filmmaker I worked for made a film about the Iraq War. He wanted to include a 1-minute clip from an interview George Bush gave on Meet the Press, and this 1-minute clip was where George Bush explained why he went to war, the most important decision a president makes. When they asked permission from NBC to do this, NBC told them no, and they asked why, and they said because it doesn't make the president look very good. And it's quite clear what's happening. NBC wants to make nice to the president, so the president comes on their show, and so they use copyright to protect the president in a way which interferes with the obvious political process of being able to be critical of politicians for their decisions, or at least the emptiness or weakness of their justifications for their decisions. The problem is that, at least in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans are captured by this extremist vision of intellectual property. And the extremists don't even understand that there's another side to this issue. They think, the issue is just whether you believe in intellectual property or whether you're opposed to intellectual property, as if you question intellectual property, you have to be a communist, as I've been called many times. And so in the United States, there's no real opportunity for policy making here because there's no political debate about it. So one of the things that has been very important in the movement that we started with Creative Commons was to try to spread the recognition of this issue in a way which would actually make it a political issue again, so that wider range of people understood why this was a problem and began to demand of their representatives that they fix this problem. One of the reasons why policymaking doesn't track this well is that the technologists who are inventing all the cool new technology don't spend any of their time talking to policymakers. They're just inventing the new technology. And the people who spend their time talking to policymakers are 20th century businesses who are trying to get protection from the government so they're not wiped out by the internet. And that's got to change. Technologists have got to make it clear to governments that when they intervene to protect 20th century businesses, they're killing off the future, right? So, they might be movie stars that are loved within your society, but you're making a choice in favor of them versus other people who also would have been very influential and successful in societies. The Apple Corporation, their iTunes music store for 99 cents, allowing you to buy whatever song you want and download it onto your iPod and only your iPod. But you're guaranteed, at least in the United States, to be cool if you engage in this form of commercial and exchange. And it's not just music. Increasingly, videos are being circulated and distributed in exactly the same way. And it's not just Apple. Others too. Amazon experimenting with pay-per-page ways of selling books. Ebook companies experimenting with pay-per-read ways of selling books. In all of these contexts, the objective is to increasingly perfect the control that content owners have over how people consume their, end quote, culture. If you think of the future as nothing more than just a cheaper, more efficient version of the past, so if you think the 21st century is going to be a read-only culture just like the 20th century, well, the only thing is, how easy is it for me to buy culture that I have the right to consume? Then DRM is not a problem at all, because in that world, DRM is a nice tool to make sure that the markets for buying and selling culture work well. But if you think the potential here is something much more than just being able to buy culture, but instead to invite a wider range of people into the participation in creating and remaking culture and spreading their transformative contribution, then DRM totally decimates that whole new economy of creativity. Because what digital rights management, when it's fully implemented, will do is it will block you from using your technology to do creative work with material that which you've purchased or you've gotten access to. So people who think only in the terms of the 20th century can't see why DRM would be any problem. But I think people who begin to recognize what's exciting about the 21st century see DRM as an environmental disaster, because in the ecology of creativity, DRM is kind of DDT sprayed to kill a gnat, and it will kill, the gnat of piracy, but will also kill off a whole other ecology of creativity that I think ultimately would be much more important.
In der nächsten Woche, liebe Zuschauer, wird uns Lawrence Lessig erklären, warum ihm Nachrichtensprecher im Fernsehen leid tun, warum man mehr Bücher verkauft, indem man sie verschenkt, und warum sich traditionelle Medienunternehmen in der neuen Medienwelt so furchtbar schwer zurechtfinden. Und wo wir gerade von der neuen Medienwelt sprechen, was ist eigentlich Web 2.0?
Web 2.0 ist, wenn Amazon mehr Wunschzettel bekommt als der Weihnachtsmann.
Vielen Dank. Sie ahnen es vielleicht schon, liebe Zuschauer, das war es bereits für heute. Ich verabschiede mich und wünsche Ihnen eine inspirierte Woche. Bleiben Sie uns gewogen und schalten Sie auch das nächste Mal wieder ein. Bis dahin bleibe ich Ihr elektrischer Reporter.
In was für einer Gesellschaft wollen wir leben? Wir brauchen Ihre Antworten, Ihre Ideen und konkrete Projekte. Machen Sie mit unter www.diegesellschafter.de.
Die Bedeutung eines gegenwärtigen Details ergibt sich immer aus dem Ende, zu dem es beiträgt.